Hello, everyone. Uh, I'm Teddy Downey, executive editor here at the Capital Forum, and I'm pleased to be joined by Carter Dougherty, senior fellow for Anti-Monopoly and Finance at Demand Progress. We'll be discussing his recent article for the Sling, Visa, and Mastercard, the original Gangsters of Electronic Collusion, which examines how Visa and Mastercard's payment network practices compared to the conduct alleged in the RealPage litigation, and what that may reveal about competition in the payments market. Carter, thank you so much for doing this today.
Thank you for having me, Teddy. I'm a big fan of the Capitol Forum.
So, quick note, we will take questions from the audience. If you have questions, please put them in the questions pane or in the chat, and we'll get to them later on. So, first off, Carter would love, well, first of all, maybe tell us a little bit about your role. I mean, seems like a very specific role. Uh, I'm just interested in, what it is that you do on a day-to-day basis, and then if you could just tell us how you came to focus on Visa and MasterCard, that would be great.
Yeah. So my role as this clumsy title, Senior Fellow for Antimonopoly and Finance, I sort of cooked up, and the idea was to look at the issues of monopoly power within the financial system. Um, we could go down a list of things. There's the FICO monopoly basically on credit scoring. There's concentration in investment banking that probably keeps fees higher than they need to. There's asset management, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. We could go down the list talking about the issues around this, and I thought this deserved a lot more attention. I always felt that as I worked for a long time in the area of financial reform, and that we didn't embrace the anti-monopoly spirit as much as we should have. So I cooked up this idea of being senior fellow for anti-monopoly and finance, and Demand Progress was kind enough to embrace the idea. I also work on advocacy in areas where it looks like we might make some progress. And the interesting thing about the Visa MasterCard duopoly and their effective collusion with the big banks that issue credit cards is that there's interesting, useful legislation that has bipartisan support. Senator Roger Marshall of Kansas, a Republican, has teamed up with Senator Richard Durbin, the Democrat from Illinois, to push what's called the Credit Card Competition Act, which would, in a nutshell, break open the Visa MasterCard duopoly by giving merchants a third option to route credit card transactions, a third network, for cards issued by banks with more than 100 billion in assets. So really the big mega banks. And this is a good old, it's basically a value expressed in legislation, and that value being we should have competition, that banks and Visa and MasterCard should be competing for the business of merchants rather than just dictating fees to them. And in his desire to embrace things that would affect affordability, President Trump actually endorsed this legislation, of course, via social media. We're still waiting for this White House to carry through on its pledges to support populist legislation. There's been a lot of social mediaing about it, but not as much legislative spade work as we would like. Nevertheless, I think the fact that it's about competition and about giving everybody a fair shake speaks to the deeply ingrained anti-monopoly reflex in American politics, and that's why you have bipartisan support for this. So I work on that legislation, trying to rally consumer groups, anti-monopoly groups, sort of what you might call left-coded small business groups around this. Ones that are want to push back against monopoly power in general, both in their own industries and within finance as well. It's also possible I might spend some time working on the CFPB's open banking rule that has the potential to introduce considerable competition into the market for consumer financial services. However, you may be aware, Russ Vought initially tried to kill that regulation. Then the fintech industry pushed back really hard. So now, theoretically, CFPB is considering this. They've promised us a proposed regulation. Now we have a nominee to run CFPB, Brian Johnson, who has been a lobbyist for Capital One, one of the largest credit card issuers. So it's possible the banks now have the upper hand in this fight, but we'll see.
Well, let's can we stay on that legislation for a second? Because I saw
Sure.
you at the open markets event the other day, and one of the things that struck me was that candidates, sort of like candidates for Democrats that appear to be winning are running a very aggressive anti-establishment, anti-status quo uh campaign platform.
That's right.
That's where the winning seems to be coming from. Does that give you hope that should the Democrats win, they would be more open to bucking the status quo, which has been to basically just not do nothing because obviously the Durbin Amendment did pass at some point, but like to be more open to a more aggressive that it gives if Democrats take control of the House and or Senate, that this type of legislation is exactly the type of thing that would have more of a chance because you have these insurgent anti-status quo candidates who just they're not going to take they're going to be a lot less likely to take a call from Capital One or Visa or Mastercard than you otherwise would
Yeah.
in the Democratic Party historically.
So I believed you and I watched Dan Osborne, the independent candidate from Nebraska, speak at that open market conference that you referenced. And Osborne has actually publicly endorsed the Credit Card Competition Act. And I think the key word here is structural change. I think that in general, these insurgent candidates are tired of the sort of, if I may, chicken shit kind of approach of nipping and tucking with regulation at the margins. What they really want to see is some structural change that injects competition, so that we have uh, people competing for the business of small businesses and consumers. And I think that really appeals to them. Now, it is probably if you looked at the progressive caucus's affordability agenda, finance was not on there, and I think personally think that's a mistake. And I've told the chair of the progressive caucus I think that's the case. I think you could introduce some things into that, but definitely these candidates are thinking big, and they're thinking differently than candidates have in the past who might talk about having strong regulations, that sort of thing.
I thought it was really interesting. Equally interesting was how outraged the centrist Democrats were that there was this challenge to the status quo, which I find equally just shocking from a lack of self-awareness. I mean, party routinely ousted out of power for like you would think that they would change at some point. I mean, the Republicans at least have gone through a lot of iteration of change. Tea Party, MAGA. I mean, they're at least responding at some
Yeah.
level to the status quo is not working. Democrats, on the other hand, no, endlessly willing to promote the status quo, obviously with no real hope of winning in any ongoing way. I would say the other thing I thought was interesting was a willing, it's like the sort of corporate friendly Democrats are willing, they want to kick these anti-establishment candidates out of the party, and the anti-establishment candidates want to kick the pro, sort of like big business or like cozy corporatist Democrats out of the
Mhm.
party. it's a really interesting moment for the Democratic Party. It's being
Yeah.
described as civil war, you know.
Well, first of all,
Yeah.
you know, let's have a debate. It's a democracy, right? Like nobody's asking, I don't think the Democrats who want structural change are suggesting they don't have to make an argument. What I do think sometimes is that the centrist, the so-called centrists, I prefer the term corporate Democrat, you know, they sort of stake this claim where they say we're centrists and therefore we deserve deference because being centrists is a good thing. And when you pick apart, like, what does centrist mean actually? Like you take somebody like Josh Gottheimer, it means sort of wrapping yourself in the mantle of civil rights. The guy had worked the Civil Rights Commission and being pro-Israel and taking a lot of money from Wall Street. And I think what you really hear from some of these folks is that their political formula has kind of fallen apart and come under criticism. The same one that Bill Clinton used and Obama to a certain extent. And now they're being forced to justify it. I don't have any problem with centrists personally, but I'll have a policy debate with them. But just saying you're centrists is not really telling me anything about what you want to do. Anyway, a little off the subject of payments, but
No, no, I think
if
this is all relevant just because, like, what is the environment? What is the political support for doing something on all these issues? At the center of it is that Democrats historically have a big wing of their party that wants to help the credit card companies, right?
yeah,
We'll take their
yeah,
money and we'll do their work for them. I mean,
and the banks
yeah,
especially.
I mean, it's banks and credit card. Like, that's just a big part of the party. And it's just like, are you going to kick those people out? And then you're going to maybe do something that they don't want. Or if you just keep them, so it, to me, this political struggle, and I always look back to just to be predictive is like, who is winning, right? Like, what is the winning candidate? And I think some of these anti-establishment candidates are literally socialists or they're like communists or whatever. They're literally saying, hey, I want a different economy altogether. Then you have other people like Osborne who's like, I want a more competitive economy, right? Like I want real capitalism or whatever so you're getting
Yeah, I
this,
mean, I
a lot
I
of these
personally think this.
anti-establishment views. No, go
I
ahead.
personally think this socialist thing is a little overwrought because, and I noticed in a interview that Zoran Mandani, they say you're a socialist. He says I'm a democratic socialist. But you look at things that he's embraced, like a public option for grocery stores. Well, we already have a public option for medical insurance, and this public option notion has a long history.
Well,
There
even
used to
that's
be
like
a proposal.
competitive, right? Like you're
Yeah,
you're you're
right.
introducing something that's competitive. It's not really socialism
Yeah.
unless you're like taking the whole thing
So,
over.
but
Yeah.
it's a label, and it's of course it's going to get used because it's politics and everything. But to me, what I think the analysis you described sort of leaves out is when it comes to anti-monopoly purposes, is that the potential for a Republican support for some of these measures massively undermines the corporate Democrats' grip on things because if progressives can come up with ideas that slice off a number of Republicans, arguably even a small portion, then it really disempowers these corporate Democrats who, in their own way, benefit from hyperpolarization because you can't get all Democrats to support something, then you're screwed. So I think that political dynamic might end up being, as regards anti-monopoly issues, more important than just the narrow question of what sort of debate there is among the Democrats.
Okay, we've got a question. Are there going to be actual practices of credit card issuers and banks that are going to be discussed? Well, we're getting there. We're getting there. Sorry for the lead up. So, point of the paper
Daddy dragged me
was,
there, I want the record
yeah.
show.
Well, look, I think it's all interesting context because like you look at credit card companies holistically, like what is their regulatory risk? What is the outlook for their legislative and regulatory risks? This legislation is a big deal. So I mean it must be because I get advertised incessantly about how dangerous it will be to reduce the
Mm-hmm.
choice of the citizens to have Visa and Mastercard get their way in an
Yeah.
ongoing way.
You're
So
seeing ads by the Electronic Payments Coalition. That's the card
uh,
networks and the big banks, and
yeah,
they're
yeah. They're
getting
they're they're endless. Sorry for people who don't live in DC, but like there's a lot of money being thrown at this. So there's certainly some state high stakes here. But let's get to the paper. We've focused a lot on algorithmic price fixing here at the Capitol Forum. You mentioned RealPage, a few other big cases, but you argue, hey, the uh the Visa and Mastercard are the original gangsters in this space. How do you see collusion in that market, matching up well with a crackdown on algorithmic price fixing.
Yeah. So, we all know there's been a lot of discussion of how RealPage works. It gives basically landlords share information, and RealPage gives them advice to on how to maximize rents without the landlords actually explicitly sharing information with each other. And, Jonathan Cantor has called this, more effective collusion than your proverbial smoke-filled rooms. Now, just to bear in mind here, what we're talking about is the fees on credit cards, which are, collective term is swipe fees, or 2.5, pushing 3% in some cases. And merchants paid about $200 billion in swipe fees last year. That number has doubled since the pandemic. That's debit and credit card swipe fees that I just mentioned there, and shows no sign of abating. Just, I think it was about 10 days ago, Visa announced a bunch of new network fees that will probably cost merchants about $3 billion more a year. And consumers never see this. This money is simply deducted from the price of something you pay with a card, and then it goes to Visa and Mastercard, who then share the bulk of the money with the card issuing banks. Now,
Well,
the
in
note,
fairness, they're
yeah,
typically the grocer is probably going to raise prices to deal with the higher fees, right? Like if they want to keep their margins, they want to keep their revenues flat, they've got to raise prices.
yeah, I mean, you got to bear in mind that a lot of merchant areas, which is a broad category, but let's take, restaurants are very competitive. Their margins are very, very low. So can they all pass it on? Do they have to squeeze margins? I mean, it's true that the consumer pays for it. It's also true that it makes it harder to be a small business under the boot of the Visa Mastercard duopoly. But, to your point about them being the original gangsters, I was looking at some of the investigations that have been done of Visa Mastercard, and I one Visa executive said at a hearing in 2010, this is a direct quote, "We work very closely with our financial institution clients on a daily basis." And a JP Morgan Chase executive said, "We are in regular communication with the networks, Visa and MasterCard." And I imagine for a moment if landlords said that out loud, in a public forum. This is practically an invitation for an antitrust lawsuit, and yet somehow this can be said publicly, uh, between Visa, Mastercard, and the big banks, and somehow we accept it as okay.
And the
And
analogy there being the landlords are talking to RealPage.
yeah, yeah,
They're in constant communication with their
yeah.
pricing recommendation
And I think the
algorithm.
key issue is, can ostensible competitors work in parallel? Does the system enable that? Because that's what you don't want, to have a competitive market, right? You don't want landlords to be able to say, "Hey, we're all going to raise our rent by 10% so that no renter can do anything about it." Well, you take a look at what Visa and Mastercard do. They have a bird's eye view of spending patterns. They share analytics with the bank, and this is no great secret. I'm looking at how Visa and Mastercard market their services to banks. This is all on their website. Card issuers have their own repository of data about merchant acceptance of payment cards, and on and on and on. This is not a secret. So, but what it enables is this sort of working in parallel of the sort that RealPage enables for landlords. And it's this combination of information and tight relationships that create what in antitrust lingo is known as a soft coordination problem.
So it is in this case, uh, I guess Visa and Mastercard are setting the price, but they're are they're sort of are they the real page in this, or are they the landlords in this?
I think they're a bit
Which are
more
the
the real.
banks?
I think they're a
Yeah.
bit more the RealPage
Okay.
because the swipe fee
Yeah,
is
they're
network
yeah.
fees plus an interchange fee that goes to the banks, and the interchange fees are the larger portion of that.
Got it. So the banks, the networked banks are the landlords, and
Yeah,
the Visa and Mastercard are the real page. They're the software that's enabling the collusion to
yeah,
occur.
yeah. And I think an easier sort of counterfactual way of thinking about this is think about a system in which banks had to compete for the business of merchants to say, "Hey, please accept my card." You know, there would be a lot of competitors, and they would compete on price, and they would say, "Hey, if you use my card, the interchange rate might be, X%. And use mine, it'll be X minus 10." This sort of price competition simply does not exist.
Yeah. And when you look, you mentioned litigation that's already out there in your paper. What did you think of that? And where do you think we should see more litigation on this? I mean, this is a
Yeah.
truly burgeoning field of algorithmic price fixing lawsuits. We've seen a novel one in state court in California recently on the Calibrate software around price setting for
Yeah.
fuel at the pump. Um, you mentioned a bunch of lawsuits in your paper. Like, what do you see of the law litigation that is already ongoing with Visa and Mastercard, and what would you like to see in terms of more litigation in this space?
So the big 10-year litigation going on with Visa and MasterCard is something that this is one thing I've worked on, sort of opposing a settlement there because it emerged because some merchants sued Visa and MasterCard. Litigation was consolidated. The judge assigned plaintiffs' counsel to do it, and they've been sort of going back and forth for 10 years about a settlement. But none of the settlements that they've come up with have been meaningful structural change. They basically would impose some limits on bank friendly limits and Visa and MasterCard friendly limits on swipe fees. So that litigation shows no promise whatsoever in being able to reach a useful resolution. The Justice Department under Jonathan Cantor did start the litigation on uh, Visa debit card practices, and that shows a lot more potential. There, they had a lot of interesting evidence about Visa's whole approach of we don't have competitors, we have partners, and using its war chest to sort of buy off potential competition. Wasn't that long ago, Teddy, that people thought that PayPal might be a massively disruptive kind of way of payments happen, and of course, it never happened. I think though one of the big hurdles we need to get over if we're gonna challenge this system is what I call the tyranny over our minds that says that this system has to be this way. The Visa MasterCard system evolved out of bank cooperatives, which slowly replaced what had been a merchant-centric system where merchants said, "Hey, let's have charge cards." Like if you're like me and grew up in the '70s, you remember people talking about charge cards. Um, and the banks basically slowly took over that system through these cooperatives, Visa, Mastercard. And then they also used credit card issuance to sort of break out of the New Deal settlement on finance, which emphasized small local uh, financial institutions, smaller banks, and became nationwide issuers of credit cards and built the system that way. And it was a way of getting past boundaries against business across state lines. So for that reason, because the system evolved that way, we've come to think of there's something natural about, oh, you've got a payment network, you've got a bank, you've got this. In fact, technology would enable many, many other options for payments if if Visa, Mastercard together with the banks did not have this sort of collusive system in place in which Visa, Mastercard are the dominant networks, and five banks are responsible for issuing the cards that about used about 70% of transactions. I do think, Teddy, that if you're going to have a serious legal assault on the system, it's going to take some very determined antitrust enforcers who can pick apart how this system works. I think I wrote in that piece, it's a sort of hybrid of old and new, right? It preserves the old relationships of when Visa and Mastercard were cooperatives, but uses technology to fortify the collusion. To my mind, that's really going to take a determined somebody, attorney general, assistant attorney general for antitrust, to dig into that, to use subpoena power to really understand those relationships.
And you mentioned a lot of these sort of black box, sort of just negotiations over how they set the prices.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we've done a bunch of reporting on that front. That seems to me kind of like smoking gun evidence when they're like doing they have these price sheets. Why why can't you just subpoena that stuff and and present that? Like, what is the weakness? There's such a lack of transparency on how these prices get set. And then there are rules, like the Fed is supposed to have rules on like how that's done and why that's done. It's supposed to be like, at least for debit, right? It's
Yeah,
supposed to be tied to cost, the cost of doing it at
yeah.
some level. Um,
Two, two
where
things.
do what do you see in terms of the value of subpoenaing those documents, and then also the Fed in terms of like enabling the price increases by
Yeah.
being sort of asleep at the switch as a regulator?
So first of all, solely on the federal issue, you're alluding to the Durbin Amendment. The Durbin Amendment was passed in 2010. The banks made a big effort to repeal it the following year and failed barely. And so the Fed then wrote a bank-friendly regulation that did reduce debit interchange fees, but not by a whole lot and not by as much as it initially proposed. And there's some evidence and the Fed was repeatedly sued about this, is still being sued because it basically invented an extra category of costs and said the banks should be allowed to recover this. And there is some evidence to suggest, remember, this is the time of 2010, 2011, wake of the global financial crisis, where bank profitability equated in the eyes of the captured Federal Reserve to bank stability. And so they sort of let through a bank friendly rule. Now, on the credit side, there's transparency and then there's transparency. Anybody can pull up the Visa interchange uh, schedule and see how, what card charges what. I dare anybody who's not a serious specialist, and, I spent a lot of time on this and I still find it extremely challenging to understand the Visa rate sheet. And this is typical across finance to get to me, my broader role in life is this weaponization of complexity is really pronounced when it comes to who charges what for credit card fees. And I'll add that, and again, an indicator of exactly how competitive this market is. If you are a merchant, um, it is hard to get the time of day from Visa or Mastercard. Stuff comes down, oh, we're increasing this fee, and that's the beginning and the end of it. It at no point as a merchant accepting cards do you have the sense of anybody competing or even really caring about your business. It's what you feel is an assertion of power, similar to the
Unless you're like
renter.
Walmart, unless you're Walmart, right? Or Target or Costco, and then you like cut your own deals, right?
There is some evidence of that. It's not as much as you would expect. The power of financial monopolies is strong. And it's one reason why I've consistently argued that finance is the most powerful industry in the world. And even faced with big players like that, they can mostly get the world. Yes, there has been some nips and tucks. A big retailer like Costco might say we're not taking American Express, that sort of thing. There was a time when certain places would only take debit. Um, there's some flexibility at the margins, but they're not a systemic solution, and they're no solution at all for a smaller business.
Well, you also have they get special treatment from the Supreme Court. Supreme Court says their regulator uh is independent, has to be
Yes.
remain independent, unlike all the other regulators, which are now
Independent of the
subject.
president, not independent of Wall
Independent
Street.
of the president. Yeah, yeah. Independent of the president, like unlike
Yeah.
every other regulator now.
Yeah.
Um, well, I want to get back to I want to get back to this litigation. So what is the path forward in terms of solution here? You've got your legislation. You've got your, at some point maybe the Fed could uh take its responsibility more seriously. You've got litigation ongoing. What do you see of the, I mean, or you've got potential for algorithmic pricing, investigation at the state level. Obviously, nothing's happening at DOJ or FTC for the next 2 years on this, I would imagine, despite Trump's, social
Hmm.
media posts. You got state investigative capabilities. You got private plaintiffs. I mean, going back to the open markets event, Elizabeth Warren said, "Look, the anti-monopoly movement is going to be at the state and local and private plaintiff level."
Hmm.
What are the options for those uh, policymakers and law enforcers and private plaintiffs firms if they want to tackle this? Is it, look, you got to get your hands dirty and investigate and unwind this, uh, the myriad interconnections here before we have a good grasp, or is there any additional solutions that you see for these decision
Yeah.
makers?
So so there's the policy solutions, there's the legal solutions. I'll throw out two more that might be useful. One is the technology. I mentioned earlier that we have other technologies that can facilitate payments. And you only have to look as far as well, Brazil's far away, but look at Brazil. Brazil created a system called Pix, which is a payment system built around a simple pay by bank system in which then there's an interface that people can use on their phones. And it's become common to say in Brazil, what's your Pix? Because that's how you send people money, whether it's scanning at a retailer or sending to your friends. It's sort of like a combination of bank plus Venmo, but without all the middlemen that take their chunk of money. And the Brazilian central bank, to their immense credit, they just said, look, this ought to be a net moving money, which is really all that debit and credit are. Moving money is should be a negligible cost, and we're going to make sure that's the case. Now, I'm under no illusion that we're going to sort of make a decision to disempower massive financial institutions and Visa and MasterCard sort of overnight. But there are other steps, like for example, the Fed built a real-time payment system called Fed Now, often referred to as Fed later, Fed maybe, Fed sometime in the future, because they don't require that banks use it. But that is a potential technological backbone to other forms of payment that flow through your bank without the need for Visa or Master, that essentially would disintermediate Visa and Mastercard, and would allow cheaper payments in real time. I mean, it's also beyond ridiculous that many payments in this country are still batch payments, right? ACH sort of lumbers through over the rails like it's on a Sunday afternoon walk. So that's the sort of technological change that you could envision a system where there's FedNow required for all banks, and there would be technological interfaces built on top of that. And boom, you could do it. Um, there's also, a central bank digital currency would have some similar promise that is now tied up in sort of endless toing and froing in Congress, and frankly, fervent ideological debates about whether a central bank digital currency is a way to spy on you. So, not holding out a lot of hope for that. A second issue I would mention, and I would definitely consider this a sort of sleeper with some potential, but you never know, is you may have noticed when you go to pay for things, restaurants or something, restaurants are starting to now tack on, 3% surcharge for uh, use of credit. This reflects a change that's happened over the past 10 years. Going back 30, 40 years ago, American Express in particular, but other credit cards too, obtained anti surcharging laws in states that said you can't surcharge for the use of credit cards. And they were building on an insight, what we now call behavioral economics, that says that people will do more to avoid a loss than they will to acquire a gain, which is why surcharging is bad, but discounting is okay. And the credit card companies obtained these laws banning surcharging, with the exception of filling stations, of gas stations, which is why you drive around and you see there's a price for cash and there's a price for credit, because the gas stations were too politically powerful not to get an exemption. Anyway, over the last 10 years, those laws fell and it became possible for merchants to surcharge. This has started to happen in piecemeal fashion, um, not across the board, but you do see merchants saying, hey, Visa, MasterCard, they charge us outrageous amounts of money for the use of credit cards, so we need to pass this on. And I would not rule out over time that this starts to tarnish the Visa, MasterCard brands, where people say, what the hell? Why is this happening? Again, it's a long shot, and there are real competitive issues there, because if the restaurant next door doesn't surcharge, um, they make it look like it's not a problem and it's a competitive issue with the other restaurant. There's a lot going on there. Um, and frankly, it's a substandard solution because it turns the merchants into the toll collectors for Visa, MasterCard, and the big banks. And that's just crazy. Like, this is that if you want to define financialization, it's like the real economy forced to be toll collectors for finance.
We have some big changes that are happening in California. Rohit Chopra is going to be a new, very powerful regulator there with some CFPB-like authorities. What do you think are the chances that you could see some creative solutions like that would open up competition for California, like a California coin or a California new rules there to facilitate some change or
Yeah.
penalties or what have you? Is that an option?
So there have been proposals in the states to attack swipe fees in a more limited way. And the proposals have been that you ban swipe fees for taxes and tips. And the rationale here is that merchants don't benefit from taxes or tips. Those go to the government or to the workers. And therefore, why should a merchant pay a fee on those? Now, those have run straight into the teeth of bank opposition, lots of lobbying opposed. They got Jared Polis in Colorado to veto one such law, and they sued to oppose a similar law in Illinois. What's more, the Trump OCC, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, has come to the rescue of the big banks and has basically insisted that when fees are set by third parties, that is protected activity by nationally chartered banks, and therefore state laws are illegal. This is the big, uh, long-standing debate over preemption, whether the how much the OCC can preempt state laws in the name of preserving the integrity of the national bank charter. And this is all the big banks, JP Morgan, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, they're Citigroup. They're all national banks. What's really going on here is that the OCC is behaving like a sort of big bank lobby from within the government. And they want to preempt these laws. This is now going to be the subject of extensive litigation. So I think vibrant state officials, be they enforcers like attorneys general or regulators who can give voice to the problems in the payment system, I think they're going to play important roles in ideation for ideas that we can use to sort of make the payment system more just, but also litigating. And I would expect that this fight with the OCC is going to be a lengthy one. Preemption stuff always takes forever and goes to the Supreme Court. But in this particular case, the OCC is making a particularly outrageous claim, which is that any fees that are set by third parties are any legislation stopping that is preempted by state law. So they're opening a Pandora's box here. They're saying banks, as long as you use a third party to set a fee, it's all good. And I think that's going to attract the attention of a lot of state enforcers who do not want to encourage more collusion on bank fees.
I again, if we have listener questions, if you have a question, please feel free, enter it in the chat here or into our Q&A thing on the Zoom. Now, Carter, I mean, I know you're a bit of a student of the OCC. How corrupt is this institution? Like, but historically, or just now, like, what are we talking about in terms of just like how in bed this regulator, is with its
Yeah.
own
So
customers, not customers, the banks that it's
yeah.
supposed to be overseeing and
So
regulating.
quick bit of history is that the banks and the OCC love to talk with reverence about the OCC has been created in the Lincoln administration, the National Bank Charter, and some former comptrollers even perpetuate what is really an untruth that Congress wanted to change the fragmented banking system. What Congress really wanted to do at that time was create a new market for U.S. government bonds to finance the Civil War. And so they required these new national banks to hold their reserves in government bonds. So overnight, there was suddenly a massive market. And who benefited from that market? Well, Jay Cook and his brother, uh, ran the largest U.S. government bond underwriter in the country. And the brother was good friends with Salmon Chase, the Treasury Secretary, and they engaged in what we would today call astroturfing to get this legislation passed. So it was a corrupt incarnation from the beginning. And ever since then, the OCC has been a vigorous defender of the privileges of big banks. They did the same thing, during the era where there were these fights over the gold standard, silver, and everything, always on the side of big banks, of preserving their privileges. Fast forward to now, I had an interesting conversation with Tom Curry, who was appointed to run the OCC after the financial crisis, and he thought that there was good expertise in the OCC, and therefore he took the job. He thought this can be reformed. And once the second Trump administration rolled in and basically invited bank lobbyists in to run the place, he said, I'm really leaning toward the abolition of the OCC because I just think it can't be effectively reformed. Time will tell, but I mean, look at the cast of characters. The first Trump uh, comptroller was sort of tucked in there, by default. That was a bank lobbyist. The second one was a crony of Steve Mnuchin's who just wanted to gut the Community Reinvestment Act. Um, then it was really hard to get anyone confirmed in the Biden administration, so there was a Fed official who was the acting comptroller, and now in the Trump administration we have Jonathan Gould, who's just a longtime financial services lobbyist. So it really is nothing but a revolving door and looking for every possible opportunity to do favors for the banks.
Again, if you have questions, please put them in the chat or in our Q&A panel. I want to get back really quickly to how you see, are you looking at the case law when it comes to algorithmic price fixing as, well, if this gets to be more robust and becomes a new avenue for litigation, this could be a solution? Or is it really more the analogy that if you're if the courts are cracking down on this type of collusion, they should be just as willing to crack down on Visa and
Yeah,
MasterCard?
yeah. So the the third party aspect of this, where Visa, MasterCard function as these sort of price setters, um, is a challenge. Um, because, proving that in a court of law and, a legal theory that effectively captures that conduct is a challenge because of the third party aspect. It is, however, egregious. And in writing the piece that you referenced, I started to think about this. And, like popular imagination, I imagine if you had to name a cartel, you'd probably name OPEC, right? And OPEC doesn't actually set prices. What they do is, in the messy geopolitics of petroleum, they try to manage supply, and have a target price, but are constantly, grappling with members who don't abide by quotas and people outside and, producers outside the system and whatever. And even RealPage doesn't actually set prices. They just sort of wink and nod as much as they can to their clients, the landlords. Visa and MasterCard, they just set prices. So I think the combination of the egregious nature of the conduct and the rising understanding that we're going to need a legal theory to deal with allegations of third party based collusion, I think speaks favorably to coming up with something in the future. But what it is another matter.
It kind of reminds me of in the healthcare space, you have this company called Multiplan, which is this sort of like third party, but it's organized by the big health insurers to set the prices that the insurers are going to pay uh, to the providers,
Mm-hmm.
healthcare providers, and that has been sued in different ways over time. First, successfully by Andrew Cuomo as AG in New York for fraud, right? This is not an independent price, right? You're
Right.
you're going around saying this is like some independent price setter, but it's really just an arm of the insurance industry. And then they've subsequently been sued for antitrust. And actually, the insurers are sued, and Multiplan is sued as being in collusion with the insurers. Have you seen? I mean, yeah, I mean, obviously, there's that case that's sort of out there,
Mhm.
that big antitrust case that has been settled. Um, Curious if you think maybe fraud for how they represent this as like some kind of neutral third party
Yeah.
price setting.
The challenge with Visa and MasterCard is the manner in which they are not consumer facing. And here I mean this very narrowly, not that a credit card's not consumer facing, but Visa and MasterCard. We don't use Visa and MasterCard in the sense that we explicitly pay for their services. What we do is we use a card issued by a bank that is routed through this. So that makes this sort of fraud aspect vis-a-vis the end consumer sort of fades away, right? It's not, they're not the ones explicitly being pitched. So that that is going to be a challenge in, barring like outright fraud. You do see plenty of you've seen plenty of challenges over time to the practices of credit card companies, credit card issuers. There was significant enforcement by the CFPB under that, but that was not about this core problem of why the payment system is too expensive. That was about explicit fraud of consumers.
Last question. You mentioned Dan Osborne explicitly endorsing this. Are you involved or are you seeing that happen at a broader level? To me, the more immediate risk to these companies seems to be at the legislative level, state, federal legislation that would entertain one of these solutions that you're mentioning, as opposed to litigation, which we've seen over the years, it just takes so long
Mm-hmm.
and ends up getting settled for money instead of systemic reform. Uh, what are you seeing at the political level beyond just the Osborne anecdote? Are you seeing more attention to merchant issues or independent business issues and sort of making it uh coming up with a solution here for that constituency?
Yeah, I think the revival of the anti-monopoly movement, over, we'll say roughly the past 10 years, that was, at the on my conference that you mentioned, that was referenced. It was 10 years ago that Elizabeth Warren gave a landmark speech saying we need to reinvigorate antitrust enforcement. That has provided, I will say, the music to the lyrics of what small merchants have always said about Visa and MasterCard, which is, big entities crushing smaller ones. And I think that is fundamentally different than the way merchants would have talked about the problems with Visa and MasterCard and the big banks, say, 11 years ago. Or, it's taken a while for that sort of language of power and of this being important for decentralization and democracy. And that lends a sort of vocabulary and ethos and really a long-term drive to the effort to reform the payment system and particularly deal with these anti-competitive practices. On a more concrete level, it is probably safe to say that the Visa, MasterCard, and the big banks benefit from dysfunction in the United States Congress because it's very hard to move legislation independently right now. The Schoolhouse Rock version of, oh, the House passes it and the Senate passes it. They have a conference committee and then they pass the final bill and the president signs it. Like in reality, most legislation is getting passed either because it has to pass, like budget, or is deemed politically necessary to pass, like the National Defense Authorization Act, and then there are efforts to attach it to things. So I think that's the pattern you will continue to see in the sort of the legislative dysfunction we have. But it is not a trivial chance that this legislation passes relatively soon. This is a high priority for a lot of small merchants, and they make their voice heard, and they have the sort of greater motivation to do it now that there's something concrete to attach to. I will also add, in order to toot the horn of my employer demand progress and other anti-monopoly and consumer groups, is that one of the things we very much want to do is lend legitimacy to the claims by small business that this is a problem by pointing out that it is also a problem for consumers and for competition. And we want to be a voice that can weigh on the scales toward reform in the name of smaller merchants. This is an area where we think that the interests of anti-monopolists and consumers are very, very much aligned, and we're willing to fight for that alongside them.
And last question. What you mentioned the importance of having Republican and bipartisan backing. Obviously, you've got the Trump administration, Trump himself saying, at least ostensibly through social media, he's behind the bill. What are the other, what is the politics of the other Republicans that support the legislation? Are they doing it to help merchants? Are they doing it to whack the banks? Like what is the political impetus for Republicans, which, it's the party of big business. I don't think it's unfair to say that generally, but so these outliers from the party, what are their politics and why are they supporting the bill?
Yeah. So Senator Marshall, I think, is a guy who came down on the side of merchants in this fight. He thought they had a good case. I will add that the banks did not endear themselves to Senator Marshall by running ads against him in Nebraska and just sort of criticizing the whole idea. There was some unknown entity that ran a weirdly anti-woke homophobic thing that targeted Marshall, that did nothing but cultivate bad will, all for Kansas doesn't have any banks over $100 billion, so it's not like there's some Kansans particularly opposing the legislation. It was outside money, from Visa, Mastercard, and the big banks. I think in other cases, I was talking to one time to the staff of a Republican attorney general, who just said in general his boss was always very sympathetic to the small business merchant thing, and did not see any particular reason per se to align with big banks and Visa and Mastercard, and that was another state that is not home to big banks or big networks. So the Republican, there are those sort of interests that they have, but I think to get back to why anti-monopoly is having a generational moment and why it has had legs in American history, it's because nobody's nobody's trying to argue as an anti-monopolist that you should that the government should tell anybody how to run their business. They're simply saying that everybody should have a fair shot. And I think that fairness receptor, that sense that everybody deserves their shot, is a very powerful idea in this country. It won't die. You can't kill it, no matter how much you lobby or spend money on it. And that's going to persist, and that's what we're going to hang on to.
Well, I can't think of a better way to tie up this call, Carter. It was a really interesting paper that you did. I encourage everyone to take a look. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you for having me, Teddy.
And thanks everyone for joining the call. You can find us on Second Request podcast. Obviously Carter will be up there shortly, and you can check out our TCF Investigates podcast on the Capital Forum podcast channel. So please check that out when you get a chance. Thanks again to everyone for joining us today. This concludes the call. Bye-bye.